Hello and welcome to Raj Sabha TV, watching the big picture with the host Rajat Kane. In this edition of the show, we'll discuss the issue of push to expand the UN Security Council, which is tasked with primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Of late, France has emerged as a leading voice to expand the powerful global body with its envoy to UN, underlining the need to place India, along with Germany and Brazil, as permanent members. The French envoy also added that the enlarged reformed council is needed to reflect the world as it is. India too has been at the forefront pushing for the long-pending reform of the UN Security Council, stressing that it rightly deserves a place as permanent member. India's permanent representative to UN, Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin, had said that a total of 113 member states out of 122, which is more than 90% of the written submissions of the member states, support the expansion in the Security Council. Now, how important is the expansion of UN Security Council and what it means for India to be accorded as permanent member in this global body? To discuss more on this issue, we are joined with a guest in the studio, Professor Harshvi Pant, Distinguished Fellow, ORF, Dilip Sinha, former Ambassador, and Alok Bansal, Director, India Foundation. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. So let's start with the moot question of how important is it to have the status of permanent membership? Ambassador Dilip.
Well, it's been a policy with India for the last 25 years or so that we want a permanent membership. There was a change in our policy for the first 40 years. We did not want a permanent membership. So one did not argue that this is the most important thing for us. Right. There was a time when we were not interested in it. Even in 1993, when we submitted our written proposal to the United Nations in response to the General Assembly resolution, we did not specifically say that we wanted a permanent membership for ourselves. It was only subsequently that we put in our claim. Since then, of course, we have been pursuing this very strongly and quite legitimately. We deserve a place in the High Council because the size of our economy, the size of our population, the fact that we are a democracy. No international organization which does not have India as a member can claim to be an international organization. Right. Because any representative body must have a representation of such a large country as India. Besides, India has now emerged as a leading economy. It's the third largest economy in PPP terms. Even in terms of nominal size, the economy is quite big.
Right.
So in all respects, India's voice needs to be heard. India is a major player, not merely in the region, but also in the world. So India's voice needs to be heard. So for all these factors, I think we have a legitimate claim to this, and the Security Council would be a more representative body if India were on it.
Mr. Alok Bansal, what has been the impediments for the expansion of UN Security Council? It's a broader question. It's just a 15-member body of which only 5 are permanent members. Now, as per the definition, UN represents a larger world, but only 5 permanent members in such an important body.
See, the current composition of Security Council represents the post-World War II realities, which have not kept pace with the changing nature of the globe. And that's what French envoy to UN said, that the current Security Council is not representative. Now, having said that, the problem is who should be in. While there is no doubt that India, with its huge population, economy, ought to be there, but there will always be some countries which would not want it. Like in our case, we have Pakistan. And this has been one of the questions. Like now, the recent French statement says that India, Germany, Japan and Brazil ought to be there. Now, China has serious objections to Japan being there in the Security Council. You have in Europe, Italy trying to compete with Germany for a place in Security Council. You have Pakistan. So it's actually this factor that if we allow these, there will be some sort of an opposition that's actually kept it. In fact, Africa is not represented at all. So African representation, who should be representing it? South Africa.
Even South America, for that matter, even Far East Asia.
That's why the Brazil, of course, is now emerged as one of the clear favorites. Though there is Chile, Argentina, which is actually does not agree with this facet that Brazil should represent South Africa, South America in the UN Security Council as a permanent representative. But in Africa, of course, initially when the initial P4 proposal had gone, we had looked at these 4 countries plus 2 countries from Africa. So there has been a pressure, but I think those who are in the table don't want anybody else to come, because that would dilute their power. Because today it gives them a huge power. You saw it what happened, that from 2009 we were trying to get Masood Azhar designated as a global terrorist, and it took us 10 years. In a case which was clearly open and shut case. You had a terrorist who was released from Indian prison by hijacking a plane. But just because one veto wielding power kept delaying it, managed to do so. So there is enormous power by having the veto, and we have seen it on numerous occasions when resolutions have been vetoed by one permanent member. So obviously these countries which are used to this power, because please remember there was one time when USSR actually started boycotting the UN Security Council, and that's the time when US managed to get the resolution passed for Korean War, and that's how you had the UN force actually operating in Korea trying to push the North Koreans away. So from that time onwards, USSR realized that it doesn't make sense to boycott UN. They have to be there and keep vetoing if at all a resolution is against them. And that's what I think all the 5 veto wielding permanent members have been doing. And I think this is nice that one of the veto wielding powers, that is France, has actually realized that morally it's not correct, that this Security Council does not represent the current balance of power in the world, doesn't show the current, it's not representative of the world. In fact, as far as India's membership is concerned, I think all 5 permanent members are more or less on board.
Even China?
Even China made a very interesting statement. I remember when Pakistani Prime Minister was visiting China. I'm not talking of now, it's almost a decade back when this UN Security Council reorganization was in the forefront. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said, when a Pakistani journalist asked them, what are your views about India's bid for the UN Security Council? And they said, you can't deny 1 billion people a seat at the high table. So that's a fact. Our population, our economy makes it imperative that any expansion of the Security Council, if and when it takes place, India ought to be there on any parameters that may be laid down. And that's one of the very important facets, that for any expansion, we could possibly lay down certain parameters, and the moment you lay down parameters, India automatically gets into it.
Right. Professor Pant, same question to you. I mean, you think the current composition of UN Security Council lacks representation, and also that makes, I'm not saying it's functioning, but in principle, its operation fairly archaic and obsolete, because as Mr. Bansal also pointed out, it took us 10 years to get Azhar Masood branded as an international terrorist, which was fairly open and shut thing.
Well, yes, I think that international institutions don't exist in a vacuum. They represent the balance of power that existed at a particular at the point of their formation. So clearly, you have 5 permanent members on the Security Council that sort of reflect a certain composition of the balance of power at certain point in time in world history. I think the issue is, it's a classic case of, once you are in, do you want it to be, do you want others in as well?
Right.
Do you want to change the status quo on your own? And I think, we have no evidence in history where powers have given up that status quo on their own. So certainly there is, we talk of the flux in the international environment, we talk of how new powers have risen, we talk of the need, it is the way you have framed it is that it needs greater representation, and what happened at the end of the Second World War was, and the way UN Security Council was constituted was a classic case of a blend of realism and idealism. So while you gave General Assembly one country, one vote, you also recognize that unless you have the powers given special privileges, they will have no incentive to be part of that institution, and so you gave them veto power. And I think that made the 2-tier system very explicit. But that was needed because if you go back to the League of Nations, it was an apparent failure because the powers at that point in time were not really involved part of the process. So I think the question now is, as you move away from that 1945 balance of power, and as you have new powers in the mix, and as you have new realities shaping the international order, how can it be reflected there? And I think the question certainly is, those who are sitting there, would they want a reformed United Nations Security Council? Some of them have made different voices, different kinds of arguments about why they need, why UN Security Council needs, needs a change. And it has been, these parameters of, yes, we want greater representation, but on the other hand, others have argued, would that mean that it would become less efficient? So I think there is still a debate going on about how far do you want to take this argument and how you want to operationalize that argument. And as we have already discussed, there is no clear consensus on how you want to reform the process. So I think there are a lot of names on the table. We have been discussing these names, for a long time now. We know that certain regions, for example, are not represented. But knowing a question is not the same as knowing the answer. You know what the problem is, but I think going from that to a solution again has been quite difficult, and we know that that process has not yet worked so far. So now you have a country like France, which is again positioning itself as a defender of a multilateral order at a time when Trump administration seems to be more unilateral in its approach. And I think that's where perhaps this discussion has now emerged, whether France, along with Germany, together with a larger European Union, can formulate a response to the growing global disorder. And one of the ways they want to do it is by reforming United Nations, which according to them is not really serving the purpose of today.
Right. Ambassador Sinha, I mean, for 1993, the reforms in United Nations Security Council is pending. So what perhaps could have been the reason for reforms not happening, or rather this process moving at a snail pace? Because as there is a larger consensus that the current composition is not what UN needs to serve a purpose as a unilateral body.
Well, actually, the reform process started 1 year before that. So 1992, the General Assembly adopted a resolution on the need for reform of the Security Council. And since then, a discussion has been going on. In 2005, a kind of a position had been reached where there was a resolution on the table, but it was not put to the vote. But today, we are no closer than we were in 1992. And the reason for that is that while there is a lot of lip service by the Permanent Five to the need for reform, and many of them make all kinds of statements, the fact is that none of the Permanent Five wants reform of the Security Council. Let's be clear about this. Britain and France have made some noises about support to India, but their primary goal is to ensure that whatever happens, their position remains, because they have both joined the EU. And as part of the EU, they are required to coordinate their foreign policies. They are part of a regional organization that is almost a federation or a confederation of countries. So do they, should the seat go to the European Union or should it remain with Britain and France? That's a question that many members have asked in the past. In 2005, when there was a strong possibility of reform because the Secretary General Kofi Annan was pushing for it, at that time there was a G4 resolution on the table. And there were two Permanent Five countries that lobbied very hard with African countries to ensure that they did not vote for that resolution. And in fact, the resolution was dropped primarily because there wasn't enough support for that resolution in Africa. And that came about because of the pressure of these two Permanent Five members. One was the US, the other was China. So one has to be clear that the statements that a country makes in public does not mean the same as its real policy. Besides, apart from the Permanent Five, each of the G4 claimants has a fall country. India has Pakistan's working against it, Japan has Russia and China, Brazil has Mexico and Argentina, Germany has Italy and Russia. So you have these countries that will do anything possible to ensure that the G4 claimants do not come in. And the most difficult question is the question of Africa, because Africa wants two seats in the permanent category, but there is no consensus at all among Africa as to which these two countries would be. And there are no natural candidates coming out of Africa, especially for 2 seats. You can name 5 countries, but not 2 countries. So until that happens, one doesn't see any possibility of reform taking place.
Right. Mr. Bansal, another side to this entire issue has been Indo-France relationship. I mean, the way I see it, we saw France aggressively pushing India's case against Masood Azhar, and it was France that announced that so-and-so has happened. Now here, I mean, it's France again, which is seeking the expansion or other reforms at UN Security Council. Does the bid for India's seat in Permanent Council also reaffirms India's growing stature?
See, as far as international affairs is concerned, there has been a certain amount of affinity between India's position and France. If you remember, France under de Gaulle tried to pursue an independent policy. It actually moved out of NATO, where it removed its military forces from NATO command and all. So France wanted to pursue that autonomous foreign policy, which has been the hallmark of India. We actually went in for non-alignment. There was a congruence. If you look at it, when we went after Pokhran II, when the Western world imposed sanctions on it, it was Jacques Chirac who came for the Republic Day parade. So France has been one country who identifies itself more closely with India's policies as far as international affairs are concerned. I'm not trying to say that there are no differences. There are differences. But as I said, France, right from the times of Charles de Gaulle, has been keen on pursuing an independent foreign policy or an autonomous foreign policy in a world which at that point of time was divided into clear-cut zones. So, and that was what India also pursued. So I think there has been some amount of congruence. Then of course there are business interests and other issues, and probably France feels that India as a liberal democracy and a country which pursues an autonomous independent agenda would be closer to it. And morally speaking, as I said, as Ambassador Sinha said, that all these countries publicly are not in a position to say that Security Council need not be expanded, because that would be a wrong statement to make. So publicly everybody accepts, yes, this Security Council does not represent today's world. So there is a need for reform, there is a need for expansion. But having said that, nobody wants to share power. If you already have power, you probably don't want others to come in. France has probably the least to lose, because you have two European countries, West European countries, I would put it, UK and France, and there has been a demand that EU should be given, like Italy, etc., had claimed that this seat should be taken from UK and France and given to EU. That's one of the proposals which Italy had put it up in 2005, as you remember. So I think France feels, and I think it has the least to give up. It doesn't probably fear any threat from Indian position in the Security Council. All other countries probably might see India voting against them or something in some other place. So probably that's one of the issues.
Right. Professor Pant, India may or may not be there as a member of, in a permanent member of the UN Security Council. That's fairly to be discussed. But if it happens, hypothetically, what would be on the beneficial ground for India to be a permanent member of UNSC?
Well, clearly situations like what we were dealing with Masood Azhar, and those kind of issues become redundant. So you actually are able to project your interest more powerfully at one of the most important public fora. You are directly responsible for a lot of the peace and security questions, and I think it comes with a degree of responsibility as well. I mean, let us not forget, there are costs to being there. You have to pick sides. You can't be sitting on the fence. I mean, there are times when India has decided not to take positions on a number of issues which are more conflict oriented, where you want to balance out your interests with both the parties. Once you are there, those things are apparent out in the open. You have to make choices, clear choices. So I think it's not a bed of roses, I would say. I mean, if you look at the kind of complex issues UN Security Council deals with, and the permanent members in particular are forced to come take a stand on Masood Azhar. China was put on notice, and China had to take a position at the end of it. So I think there are elements there which a country like India also needs to be a bit careful about. Do we, I think this question is not raised enough, but I think it is an important point. Do we really want to be there at this point in our evolution? There are two aspects. One is India has evolved in terms of its globalist stature. That goes without a question, given the parameters I think that were being discussed earlier. And India's profile as a global actor means that other countries are now pitching in for India's support. So you have this argument that we have seen now over the last decade, where countries like America, Russia, the Europeans have pitched in that India should be there as part of the UN Security Council. India is very important for global governance. India is very important an actor in terms of representing the wide proportion of the global community. So I think that argument goes without saying. So there is that evolution has led India to a point where I think there is growing consensus now that India should be there. But I think there is still an element of of debate which I think is which I don't see in India about the consequences of once you are there. Because the debate largely is framed around, look, you are there, it's a great thing, it signals your arrival. It does, but then it also means that on a number of questions, your position becomes more complicated. The kind of balancing that you can do outside the Security Council, you won't be able to do there. And I think that is a debate that perhaps as we get closer to this membership, would be very interesting to have and very important to have.
Right. So, Ambassador Sinha, I mean, do you also think that being a member of UN Security Council may not be the bed of roses? And as we get near that, as Mr. Pant pointed out, I mean, the responsibilities and other issues will unfold.
Oh yes, absolutely, and that will it will create so many challenges for our foreign policy. Not that we will not be able to meet them. See, right now the position is that we have been members for only 7 terms, which means 14 years in all. And very often our foreign policy machinery is not geared to the kind of deal making that the permanent 5 do all the time.
Okay.
So once we become permanent members, yes, we will have to get into that whole business of making deals with countries so that you can use your vote, your permanent position to strike deals for your benefit. Right now we don't do that, so most of the time we have actually been abstaining. I mean, go back to Korea, in Jawaharlal Nehru's time, we had abstained on several of the resolutions. Most recently, in the case of Libya, 2011, we had abstained. So that is largely because our foreign policy machinery was not geared to that kind of facing those challenges. So we took this easier way out by just abstaining. But yes, it will be a great challenge for our foreign policy. We will have to take positions. Nevertheless, as I said, once we are there, I'm sure we'll be able to meet the challenge.
Right. Mr. Bansal, you think just mere expansion of UNSC would mean reform, or reforms of UN Security Council would take a lot of other factors as well? The case in point, let me just cite an example, that one country or one permanent member having a veto power and then blocking the entire motion.
See, there have been a lot of issues. If you see the report that had come out in 2004-2005, which talked of reform of UN Security Council, there were 2 proposals. One was of semi-permanent members and one was of expansion of permanent members. Then there are issues of permanent members without veto power. In fact, in 2004-2005, there was a proposal that the G4 could be given permanent membership without veto power. So those are issues which we need to consider. But I tend to agree that on many international issues, India has been keeping aloof. It's not been the Nehruvian period when we virtually made a statement on anything and everything that was happening. But of course, we can always use abstaining as a medium, like if you are not making a comment on anything. But then again, abstaining does not actually give you that sort of flexibility, like Jamal Khashoggi's murder. India did not make a single statement anywhere. But if supposing a resolution was to be put in UN, you would have to, even if you abstained, that would be seen as making a statement. So that issue is there. But I think the state in which India is an emerging power, we ought to start taking stands. I think we have been for too long defensive and wishy-washy in those issues which directly have not affected us. I think we need to lay down certain principles on which we should take stand, and we should start, I think, taking stand on even those issues which may not directly impinge on us, but which probably we feel are morally incorrect or things like that. And I think every country has to come to that stage. If we strive for a great power status, if we are striving for a power status, if we want to be counted in world, and if we want the world to take notice of us, we ought to take that stand. We must be in a position to give our views on issues which are contentious, which may actually pit us against someone or the other.
Right, right. I'm afraid we have to wrap it up here. It's a crucial thing whether India would get a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, but of late there has been a push to have India among the top members having a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. That is also a testimony of India's rising heft in the international affairs as much as its global power in terms of economy and other strategic affairs. Thank you for watching Big Picture. Thanks, gentlemen, for joining us. Thank you.